We are Campus Attic by fans for fans, where we've always got pictures of Dick. Stout. This week we're going to Pasadena, California, to visit the place that really established Oregon's early football legacy. It was the Rose Bowl before the Rose Bowl, Tournament Park. College football's first game was in 1869. That was Rutgers versus Princeton. But there wasn't any preseason. There were no bowl games back then. That changed in 1902, however, as a scheme to sell, of all things, real estate. Rose parades had been held since 1890 as a way to entice wealthy folks from back east to come to Pasadena to buy land for a winter home in sunny SoCal. After the parade, everyone would gather in the area known as Tournament Park for a picnic. That's now located on the Caltech campus. Events were held at these picnics like Roman chariot races and foot races, tug-of-war competitions, horse races, exotic animals were brought in, and much, much more. In 1902, a college football game was organized for the Rose Parade picnic. It was known as the East-West Tournament Game. It pitted what was supposed to be the best team from the East and the best team from the West playing each other. Another game wouldn't actually be played again until 1916, though. That was when Brown and Washington State played. But Tournament Park was the site for other big events in between. In the early days of aviation, Tournament Park was the site of several landmark flights as well. March 20th, 1909, Roy Nabenshoe piloted a dirigible from Tournament Park. And 2 years later, Cal Perry completed the first transcontinental flight from New York to California by landing at Tournament Park. In 1917, it was Oregon's turn to highlight the Rose Parade festivities. They were picked to play Penn in the third ever East-West tournament game. Now, Washington had technically won the Pacific Coast Conference, despite Washington and Oregon playing to a 0-0 tie that year. But Eugene being closer to Pasadena than Seattle, it was the Webfoots who were picked to play Penn, simply because the travel costs were cheaper. So, take that, Huskies. Even though it was cheaper to travel from Eugene to Pasadena than it was from Seattle, in order to pay for the trip for the football team, as well as an extra month of coaches' salaries, the University of Oregon student body had to sell the student bookstore located inside Fenton Hall. Now, Penn wasn't considered the best team from the East either. That was actually Pittsburgh who were awarded the national championship that year. But if you think the East Coast bias is bad today, you should have seen it back then. The media gave Oregon zero chance of beating an East Coast power like Penn. So confident of victory were Penn's coaches that Oregon head coach Hugo Bezdek was actually invited to come watch the Penn team practice, where coaches showed Bezdek a special trick double pass that they had been working on. Now, Bezdek thought the play was interesting and he thanked them for the time. In the game, Oregon ran the exact same double pass play that the Penn coaches had showed Hugo Bezdek earlier, and it went for a touchdown. Oregon would score again, and with the aid of 3 interceptions by Charles Shai-Huntington, the Webfoots won 14-0. Oregon was now the most dominant and flashy football program in the country west of the Mississippi, led by a coach thought to be the most revolutionary, forward-thinking mind, completely changing the game. That was at least until a professional sports team in Pennsylvania snatched him away. Wait a second, that kinda sounds familiar. In 1918, several Ducks returned to Tournament Park, along with coach Hugo Bezdek, under the guise of playing for the Mare Island Marines, because the President of the United States, Woodrow Wilson, decided that he wanted 2 military bases to play in the East-West tournament game. This when the nation had just been plunged into World War I, and he wanted a patriotic event. Coach Bezdek, along with several of his former players at Oregon who are now Marines, beat Camp Lewis. It was another Oregon Webfoot victory. Well, with an asterisk. Technically, it was the Marines' victory, but with so many Oregon players and Oregon's coach and the game MVP being an Oregon Duck, why not count it? On top of that, the undefeated Mare Island Marines earlier in the year had actually beaten Oregon in a game. Hugo Bezdek, who had coached baseball, basketball, and football at Oregon, was then hired to manage Major League Baseball's Pittsburgh Pirates. So with the coach leaving Eugene to manage a pro team in Pennsylvania, Oregon chose to hire from within. Wait a second, that also sounds familiar. Shai Huntington, who had famously had 3 picks and thrown and run for touchdowns in the 1917 East-West tournament game, became Oregon's new head coach. And utilizing Bezdek's old system, the good times did stick around, at least for a while. Under coach Shai Huntington, Oregon returned to Tournament Park for the 1920 East-West tournament game, but they lost on a controversial call 7-6 when an Oregon field goal that everyone there thought was good was called wide. Even the scoreboard operator changed the score to 9-7, and Harvard's players were pounding their helmets into the turf thinking that they had just lost. But the refs called it wide, and the final score remained 7-6. It was the 3rd time that one of Oregon's athletes played in the East-West tournament game. Hollis Huntington, Shai's brother. He was the MVP of the 1918 game with the Mare Island Marines, and he's the only person in history to play in 3 Rose Bowls, 2 with Oregon and 1 with the Mare Island Marines. But there would be one last, often forgotten chapter to Oregon football at Tournament Park. During the 1920 season, USC hosted Oregon, the game being played at Tournament Park in Pasadena, where Oregon just months prior had come a field goal short against Harvard. This wasn't the same Oregon team though. Ravaged by injuries and missing their star Bill Steers, Oregon's offense was so inept that day that the team resorted to punting on 1st and 2nd down for most of the game, simply hoping that their defense could somehow score. 0 passes were completed, 0 first downs, and Oregon lost to USC 21-0. It would be the last time that Oregon set foot in Tournament Park. The following year, a couple miles away, construction began on a new permanent stadium, the Rose Bowl. Upon its completion, the East-West tournament game would henceforth be known as the Rose Bowl, the granddaddy of them all, the first postseason bowl game. But for how often Oregon had made Tournament Park home during its glory years, the Rose Bowl actually proved quite elusive. It wouldn't be until 1958 that Oregon would play there, losing 10-7 to number 1 ranked and eventual national champion Ohio State. Yet in a loss, Oregon coach Len Casanova was actually carried off the field on his players' shoulders in celebration. The Ducks had outplayed a heavily favored opponent in a game where, just like back in 1917, Oregon had been given 0 chances to win. Oregon's quarterback Jack Crabtree was even named the game MVP. UCLA started playing their home games in the Rose Bowl in the early 80s, and Oregon returned to the Rose Bowl game in 1995, 2010, and 2012. Oregon claims 1917 as a Rose Bowl win. Well, kinda. It's an East-West tournament victory, and the win in 2012 finally got the monkey off Oregon's back after losing for nearly a century in the big game, with Oregon's win over Wisconsin. Tournament Park today is a track for Caltech, with a small public park behind it. Very little remains of the storied past of Tournament Park, aside from a small monument that marks the area where so much history in football and other notable Pasadena events took place, and for a stretch was for the Oregon Webfoots a home away from home. That's it for us this week. Keep checking back. It's always game day.